In Regency England, society had rules for everything: whom one may marry, where one may walk, what words one may speak in polite company. Young ladies are taught from the cradle: guard your reputation, know your place, never question the gentlemen who hold power over your fate. But what happens when the rules themselves are rotten? When propriety is a mask worn by monsters? When the very gentlemen who preach honor in drawing rooms buy human souls in shadowed auction houses? In the glittering world of Regency England, some secrets are so dark, so carefully guarded, that they exist only as whispers, unproven rumors that never quite touch the reputations of titled men. Auction houses that do not deal in horses or art, but in something far more precious and vulnerable. Girls sold by desperate families. Futures extinguished before they can truly begin. And into these shadows steps the Duke of Rothbury, a man society calls creepy, unsettling, wrong. A man who keeps his estate locked away from polite company. A man about whom the tongue whispers the most scandalous speculation, though no one dares speak it aloud. When 18-year-old Miss Beatrice Highmore finds herself standing on an auction platform, sold by her own stepfather to settle gambling debts, she knows what awaits her. She has heard the whispered warnings. She understands what becomes of girls purchased by wealthy men in secret. But when the Duke pays double any bid, an obscene fortune that silences the entire room, Beatrice prepares for a fate worse than death. Until their first night, when he does something that defies every expectation, every assumption, every rule she thought governed her world. Sometimes the man society fears is the only one brave enough to fight what society refuses to see. This is not just a tale of salvation. It is a story of partnership forged in darkness and of two souls who discover that true freedom means choosing each other, despite everything the world says they should be. I would be most grateful if you would honor me with your subscription and support to get this channel to 500 subscribers. A like, a share, these small kindnesses sustain this humble endeavor and permit me to continue bringing you tales of passion, propriety defied, and love that refuses to bow to society's dictates. Shall we begin? Chapter 1. The Auction and the Revelation. The candles had been deliberately placed to illuminate rather than comfort. Beatrice Highmore understood this the moment she was led onto the low wooden platform at the center of the drawing room, a drawing room that had once, she supposed, hosted respectable gatherings, perhaps musicales or card parties attended by ladies in white muslin and gentlemen who bowed correctly. Now its curtains were drawn against the London night, its mirrors covered, its identity stripped away as thoroughly as her own had been. She stood very still and told herself she would not tremble. She trembled nonetheless. There were 6 of them upon the platform. 6 young women in varying states of barely concealed terror, dressed in gowns not their own, gowns chosen, she understood with cold clarity, to display rather than to clothe. The woman who had prepared them, a sharp-faced creature who spoke in clipped, businesslike tones, had referred to this evening as a procurement arrangement. Beatrice had not asked her to elaborate. Some truths required no illumination to be fully understood. Before them stood perhaps 30 men. They were masked, elaborate half-masks of black and gold that lent them the appearance of figures from a Gothic tale, but their clothing was impeccable. Beatrice could identify wealth in the cut of a coat, in the quality of a cravat, in the casual ease with which men wore their consequence. These were not desperate men, not hungry men. These were lords and gentlemen and men of considerable means who had chosen to be here tonight, who had sought out this address, who had paid a considerable entrance fee merely for the privilege of participating. They spoke amongst themselves in low voices. They gestured toward the platform with the same appraising dispassion one might employ when examining horseflesh at Tattersall's. Beatrice fixed her gaze on a point above their heads and thought of her mother. Her mother, who had died 4 years past and left her in the care of a stepfather whose charm had concealed, for a time, the particular rot at his center. Mr. Alder's crew had smiled warmly at the funeral. He had spoken of duty and protection. He had spoken at considerable length about his obligations to his dear late wife's daughter. He had not spoken, 3 nights ago, when he had informed Beatrice that his debts had grown beyond his capacity to manage, and that certain arrangements had been made on her behalf. He had not quite met her eyes. He had poured himself a generous measure of brandy and told her that she ought to be grateful he had found her such a comfortable situation. She had not been permitted to take her books. That, somehow, had clarified everything. The auctioneer was a thin man with the elaborate courtesy of someone who understood that his enterprise required a veneer of civility to function. He gestured toward the young women on the platform with smooth, practiced movements, describing each in terms that Beatrice's mind mercifully began to render as pure sound, syllables without meaning, noise without content. She heard the words as though from a considerable distance. She observed the masked men below lean forward with interest, heard the occasional murmur of assessment and approval. When the auctioneer reached her, she heard her own age stated aloud. 18. She heard several other facts about her person described with clinical precision. She heard the opening bid called, and then heard it answered, and then heard it answered again. The numbers climbed with surprising speed. She counted the candles. There were 14 of them. She counted the panels on the far wall. She measured the distance to the door and understood with perfect practicality that it was irrelevant. There were 2 very large men positioned before it who had not moved since she entered. She thought about Mary Wollstonecraft, whose book she had read in secret at the lending library 3 years ago, and wondered what that formidable woman would have said about this room, these men, this carefully maintained machinery of destruction dressed in the clothing of commerce. She thought that Mary Wollstonecraft would have had a great deal to say. The bidding had climbed to a figure that made even the auctioneer's professional composure flicker with satisfaction when a voice cut through the room like a blade drawn in a quiet space. Double the current bid. The voice was cold. Not cold in the manner of cruelty, Beatrice would come to understand this distinction later, but cold in the manner of a man who had learned to keep every feeling behind glass, visible perhaps but entirely untouchable. It was a voice accustomed to being obeyed. The room went quite silent. A man stepped forward from the shadows at the room's perimeter, and Beatrice, despite every resolution, looked directly at him. He was tall, considerably taller than most men present, with dark hair and the kind of angular, severe features that portrait painters either loved or found entirely unmanageable. He wore no mask. This alone was remarkable, and she understood instinctively that it was deliberate, not carelessness, but a statement of such complete indifference to consequence that concealment seemed beneath him. His eyes, when they found her on the platform, were grey. Not the soft grey of morning cloud, but the hard, flat grey of winter stone. She knew who he was. One did not move in even the peripheral edges of society without knowing the Duke of Rothbury by reputation, and his reputation was not a comfortable one. The tongue spoke of him in lowered voices. He kept Rothbury Manor sealed against visitors, against society, against all the ordinary commerce of polite English life. He attended no balls, accepted no invitations, extended none of his own. He was reported to be in possession of several young women whom he kept in conditions that no one could quite specify but everyone seemed confident were deeply unwholesome. The whispers about him never hardened into anything provable, no magistrate had ever been called, no formal accusation made. But they accumulated, layer upon layer, into a portrait of a man who existed outside the boundaries of acceptable conduct. The creepy Duke, they called him, when they thought themselves unobserved. He was looking at her now with those stone-grey eyes, and Beatrice Highmore, who had promised herself she would not show fear before these men, felt her carefully maintained composure develop a significant fracture. No one bid against him. The silence that followed his declaration was the silence of men who had calculated their own desires against the particular weight of the Duke of Rothbury's presence and found the calculation settling firmly in favor of restraint. The auctioneer, with the smooth efficiency of long practice, confirmed the sale. The Duke produced payment in cash, an envelope passed to the auctioneer's assistant without ceremony, without negotiation, without any indication that the obscene sum it contained represented anything of significance. He did not approach the platform. He simply inclined his head toward the 2 large men at the door, and the machinery of the evening moved accordingly. The carriage was black, unmarked, and entirely silent. Beatrice sat with her hands folded in her lap and her spine very straight and her eyes fixed on the dark window, through which the lights of London gradually thinned and then vanished altogether as they moved north through the night. Across from her, the Duke of Rothbury sat with the same absolute stillness he had displayed in the auction room, his long hands resting on his knees, his grey eyes directed somewhere past her left shoulder. He did not speak. She did not speak. She was accustomed to filling silence with thought, and so she thought with great deliberateness and precision about everything she had ever heard regarding this man, this carriage, and the destination toward which they travelled. She thought about the young women rumoured to be kept at Rothbury Manor. She thought about what kept meant, in this context, spoken in these particular tones. She thought about what she had been taught, in the small ways that women were always taught, about the nature of men and the uses to which they put their power. She thought, I am 18 years old, and I came into this world with nothing, and I shall not leave it without having resisted, however the resistance ends. She was still composing the precise terms of her resistance when the carriage turned through iron gates and the darkness outside resolved into the looming silhouette of Rothbury Manor. The housekeeper, a woman of middle years with a composed face that revealed nothing, led her through corridors that were well-appointed but strangely hushed. The house held the particular quiet of a place that has learned silence as a discipline. There were no sounds of other inhabitants, no distant voices, no indication that Rothbury Manor contained anyone beyond the small procession moving through its lamplit halls. She was brought to a door. The housekeeper knocked once and withdrew. "Enter," said the voice from within, and it was the same voice, still cold, still precise. Beatrice entered. It was a study, not a bedchamber. She registered this with a relief so acute it briefly compromised her vision. The Duke stood behind a large desk, his coat exchanged for a dark banyan, a single lamp burning on the desk surface. He did not move toward her. Instead, he lifted a small key from the desk and held it out. She stared at it. "Your restraints, Miss Highmore," he said. "I would ask that you permit me to remove them. They are unnecessary, and they are," a pause so brief she might have imagined it, "offensive to me." With hands that she was distantly proud to note remained reasonably steady, Beatrice extended her wrists. The Duke crossed to her, unfastened the restraints with efficient, entirely impersonal movements, and stepped back immediately to a distance that could not be characterized as anything other than deliberate. He placed the key on the corner of the desk nearest to her. "This key opens the lock on your chamber door," he said. "There is no lock on the exterior. The key is yours to keep, as demonstration that you may secure your own privacy as you determine necessary." He paused. "You are not my prisoner, Miss Highmore. I paid double the bid this evening to ensure that no other man in that room could purchase you, to secure your freedom from men who would genuinely destroy you." The silence that followed this statement was of a different quality than the silence in the carriage. Beatrice looked at the key. She looked at the man. She looked at the careful distance he had placed between them. "I do not understand," she said, because she had been raised to value precision, and she did not, in fact, understand. What followed was the most extraordinary conversation of her 18 years of life. He told her plainly, without decoration or apology, what the Duke of Rothbury had been doing for the preceding 2 years. He told her about the network, about the lords and merchants and members of Parliament who funded and attended these auctions, who maintained impeccable public reputations while perpetuating a machinery of human destruction in the city's shadows. He told her that he had attended 11 such auctions. He told her that he had purchased 9 young women, including herself, and that every one of them currently resided either within his household receiving proper education, or had been placed in respectable employment or suitable marriages through careful arrangement. He told her there were 3 other young women presently at Rothbury Manor, and that she would meet them in the morning. And she searched for the correct word, found none adequate, selected the closest available, your purpose. In maintaining this arrangement. "The network cannot be exposed directly," he said. "The men involved are too powerful, too numerous, too careful. Any attempt at public exposure without irrefutable evidence would scatter them entirely, they would simply reconstitute elsewhere, and I would lose whatever capacity I retain to interfere with their operations." A pause. "I must appear to be as they are. I must be seen to participate as they participate. The isolation of this estate, the rumors that society maintains about my character and the briefest, most contained suggestion of grimness, my collection of companions, these are not incidental. They are essential." "You permit them to believe the worst of you," Beatrice said slowly. "Deliberately." "I cultivate it," he said, with the particular flatness of a man stating a fact he has long since made his peace with. "It serves the purpose." She could not sleep. This was not remarkable. She doubted she would sleep soundly again for some considerable time. But at some hour past midnight, when the house had settled fully into its disciplined silence, she rose and followed the faint smell of wood smoke to the manor's library. The Duke stood before the fire with his back to the door. On the mantelpiece above the flames, illuminated by their unsteady light, hung a small portrait. A girl, perhaps 15 or 16 in the portrait's rendering, dark-haired, grey-eyed, with a tentative quality to her expression that suggested she had not yet learned to conceal what she felt. He heard her enter. He did not turn. "You ought to be resting, Miss Highmore," he said. "I found myself unequal to the task," she replied. She looked at the portrait. "Your sister?" A silence that had weight to it. "Eleanor," he said. "She was sold at such an auction 5 years ago. I was 23. I had title and some means, but I did not know what I did not know." His voice remained even with the effort of a man who has said a thing so many times in the privacy of his own mind that he has worn all the rawness from it. "I searched for 2 years. I found nothing. She had simply ceased to exist as far as the world was concerned." Beatrice looked at the painted face of Eleanor Rothbury. She looked at the back of the Duke's dark head, at the rigid line of his shoulders. "Every young woman you purchase," she said quietly. "Every one you save." "Is penance," he said. And perhaps, he stopped. "It is foolish." "It is hope," Beatrice said. "You hope that someone showed her the same mercy." He did not answer. But he did not deny it either, and in the firelit silence of that strange, hushed library, Beatrice Highmore looked at the Duke of Rothbury, at his grief and his discipline and his terrible, costly purpose, and understood that she had entered this house expecting a monster. She had found, instead, a man who was quietly destroying himself so that others might be saved. The gratitude she felt was overwhelming, and enormous, and entirely inadequate to the moment. And beneath it, so faint she did not yet have a name for it, so new she could not yet bring it into the light, was the first trembling thread of something else entirely. Something she would not examine until she was safely back in her room, with the door locked behind her and the small key pressed against her palm. Something she was not, at 18, equipped to understand. Not yet. Chapter 2, Education and Awareness. 6 months at Rothbury Manor had performed upon Beatrice Highmore a transformation she had not anticipated and could not entirely account for. She had arrived in terror and departed from it, not gradually, not through any single reassurance, but through the slow, accumulating evidence of daily life in a household that operated on principles entirely foreign to her previous experience. Mrs. Alderton, the housekeeper, was brisk and respectful in equal measure. The 3 other young women, Clara, who had a gift for mathematics and an iron composure, Jane, who wept quietly on Tuesdays and was brilliant with languages, and Sophia, who had begun instructing the others in watercolor with an authority that suggested she had found, at last, the precise thing she was meant to do, received her without ceremony and with the particular solidarity of people who understood, without requiring explanation, exactly what she had survived to arrive here. The Duke himself she saw rarely. At formal meals, he sat at the head of the table and conducted himself with impeccable correctness, inquiring after their studies, their comfort, their requirements, and then withdrew so efficiently that his absence seemed almost architectural, as though the room rearranged itself around the space he had vacated. He did not linger. He did not seek private conversation. He moved through his own household like a man who has learned to make himself a guest within it. But in the library, she found evidence of him. It began with a volume of Gibbon left open on the reading table, a single sheet of paper tucked between the pages bearing 3 words in a firm, angular hand. Asterisk, you might enjoy this. Asterisk, she had read it in 4 days and left it where she found it, with her own note appended beneath his. Asterisk, Mr. Gibbon has a higher opinion of Roman virtue than the evidence perhaps warrants. I found his admiration rather more illuminating than his history. Asterisk, the paper was gone the following morning. 2 days later, a copy of Hume's asterisk essays asterisk appeared in its place. This was how they spoke, for the first 6 months. In marginalia and brief notes. In books selected with increasing deliberateness and returned with the evidence of genuine engagement. She began to understand the shape of his mind through what he chose to offer her, its rigor, its breadth, its particular interest in the intersection of moral philosophy and practical consequence. He was not, she concluded, a man who read for decoration. He read as other men might pray, with the focused desperation of someone seeking answers to questions that troubled his sleep. She understood this because she did the same. The conversation happened in October, when the nights had turned properly cold and the library fire had become the most genuinely welcoming feature of the entire manor. Beatrice had woken at 11:30 with the particular restlessness that visited her whenever her mind refused to conclude its work at a reasonable hour, and had descended to retrieve the Wollstonecraft she had left on the reading table. She had been mid-chapter when she became aware that she was not alone. The Duke stood at the far bookshelf with his back to her, in his banyan, a candle held aloft as he examined the upper shelves. He had evidently not heard her enter. She considered withdrawing and decided, in approximately 3 seconds, that she was tired of withdrawing. "I was not finished with the Wollstonecraft," she said. He turned. His expression cycled through surprise and then something that resolved, with visible effort, into his customary composure. "Miss Highmore, I was not aware you were still awake." "Nor I, Your Grace." She held up the book. "I find I cannot agree with her on every point, but I confess the experience of disagreeing with her is itself rather instructive. She argues with such rigor that one is forced to articulate one's objections precisely or abandon them." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the air of a man making a decision he has not fully sanctioned, "With which points do you find yourself in disagreement?" She told him. He listened, genuinely listened, with the focused attention of someone who found the content of the response more interesting than the fact of receiving it. When she finished, he set his candle down on the table, folded himself into the chair across from hers, and said, "Your objection is well constructed, but I believe you have misread her intent in the 3rd chapter. She is not arguing what you think she is arguing." "I am quite certain she is." "Then demonstrate it." They argued for 2 hours. Not the careful, performative disagreement of drawing-room conversation, but genuine intellectual contest, precise, occasionally heated, conducted with the mutual respect of two people who have discovered, with some surprise, that the other is genuinely formidable. He was, she found, remarkably well read for a man whose public persona suggested a complete withdrawal from civilized engagement. He was also, beneath the grey-eyed severity, in possession of a dry, understated wit that emerged infrequently but with devastating precision. At one point, when she caught him in a logical inconsistency and pressed the advantage perhaps more thoroughly than strict courtesy required, the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but bore a familial resemblance to one. She stored this away with the careful attention she gave to things that mattered. When the clock struck 2 and she rose to retire, he rose also, correct to the last, and said, as she reached the door, "You are right about the 3rd chapter. I concede the point." She paused. "I know," she said. "Good night, Your Grace." She did not see his expression as she left. She rather wished she had. The books continued. The midnight conversations did not. He was too disciplined, too watchful of his own conduct, to permit them to become a habit. But they occurred perhaps once a fortnight, apparently by accident, apparently by the coincidence of two people who kept similar hours. They discussed Locke and then Rousseau and then, with considerably more heat, the question of whether Mr. Burke's reflections represented wisdom or a failure of moral imagination. She accused him of contrarianism. He accused her of revolutionary enthusiasm. They were both, she privately concluded, at least partially correct. Clara was placed in respectable employment in March, a position as a governess to a decent family in Shropshire, arranged with the thoroughness the Duke brought to all such matters. There was a quiet dinner, a genuine farewell, and then Clara was gone, and the household contracted and continued. Jane was making extraordinary progress with her Italian. Sophia had begun teaching the village children to draw on Wednesday afternoons, an arrangement the Duke had facilitated without commentary, as he facilitated most things, by simply ensuring it was possible. Beatrice was studying political philosophy and beginning, with increasing seriousness, to consider questions of law and representation and the particular mechanisms by which society perpetuated the conditions that had produced the auction house in which she had stood. She was also, with increasing alarm, becoming aware of something she had not planned and could not quite manage. It announced itself without ceremony, somewhere in the grey days of late November, as she sat across from the Duke at dinner listening to him speak with unexpected gentleness to Jane about the difficulty of the Italian subjunctive, explaining it with patient clarity, without condescension, with the precise calibration of someone who understands that a person's dignity and their need for assistance are not mutually exclusive. She watched his hands as he illustrated a grammatical point on the tablecloth with a fork. She watched the way his severity, that constant, careful severity, softened fractionally when he perceived that Jane had understood. And she thought, *O. This is not gratitude. She tested the thought with the rigor she applied to philosophical problems. She examined it from multiple angles. She considered and discarded the hypothesis of hero worship. She had examined the Duke too closely and too honestly to idealize him. She was fully aware of his stubbornness, his occasional coldness, his tendency to make decisions about other people's well-being without troubling to consult them. She considered and discarded the hypothesis of simple loneliness. She had, by now, genuine friendships in Jane and Sophia, and friendship felt nothing like this. What she felt, she concluded with the particular horror of someone who prefers their emotional life to proceed in an orderly fashion, was love. Not the love of a rescued girl for her rescuer. Not obligation refined into affection. But genuine, specific, inconvenient love, for this man, this particular man, with his midnight library arguments and his careful distances and his annual acts of financial ruination in the service of strangers and his portrait of Eleanor on the library mantelpiece that he stood before when he believed himself unobserved. She loved his refusal to accept praise. She loved his dry wit and the rarity of it, which made each occasion feel like something bestowed. She loved his absolute, implacable ethical seriousness, and the way it sat alongside a capacity for genuine warmth that he rationed as though warmth were a finite resource he could not afford to spend carelessly. And she had recently become aware, through the accumulation of small, careful observations she stored like a naturalist cataloguing specimens, that he watched her, sometimes, when he believed her attention to be elsewhere. Not with the appraising regard of the men in the auction room. With something quieter and considerably more devastating, followed always by the immediate, visible withdrawal of that expression behind his usual composure, as though he had caught himself in an impropriety and was engaged in swift self-correction. She was not certain what to do with this information. She held it carefully and thought about it at length. It was January before she understood what the withdrawal meant. He had been growing colder for some weeks, not cruelly, not unkindly, but with the systematic efficiency of a man dismantling something before it can cause damage. The midnight conversations ceased entirely. At dinner, he remained courteous but became somehow more formal, more Duke of Rothbury, less simply himself. He left books in the library still, but the accompanying notes grew shorter, then stopped. She watched him withdraw and understood, with the analytical clarity that had become her primary defense against feeling things before she was prepared to feel them, precisely what he was doing and precisely why. He was afraid of what he felt. And he had decided, in the private court of his own conscience, that his feelings were a transgression, that the power differential between them rendered his affection not a gift but an imposition, not love but a more sophisticated form of the exploitation he had dedicated himself to preventing. He was wrong. She was quite certain of this. She was also certain that telling him so required both precision and courage, and she spent 3 weeks constructing the argument before she acted upon it. She found him in his study on a Tuesday evening, seated at the desk with estate accounts open before him, and she closed the door behind her with a quiet deliberateness that caused him to look up. "Miss Highmore," he said. His expression became, very rapidly, extremely careful. "I shall not require a great deal of your time, Your Grace," she said, because she had prepared this and intended to deliver it correctly. "I have observed your recent recalibration of our acquaintance, and I have formulated a view regarding its cause. I believe you are withdrawing because you have concluded that your feelings toward me constitute an impropriety, given the circumstances of my presence in your household. I believe you are punishing yourself for experiencing them." A pause. "I am telling you that I love you. Not from gratitude. Not from confusion. I am telling you so that you are in possession of accurate information, and so that whatever you decide with full knowledge of the facts." The silence that followed was extensive. The Duke set down his pen. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something fractured beneath the glass, visible for precisely the moment before he assembled it back into composure. "Miss Highmore," he said, quietly, "what you feel is—" "Do not tell me what I feel, Your Grace." He stopped. He began again. "What you believe you feel," he said, with the careful precision of a man choosing every word with deliberate care, "has emerged within a context that makes its accurate interpretation extraordinarily difficult. You are still so new to freedom. You have known nothing but fear, and then the safety I provided. You have lived within these walls, in this household, dependent upon my protection and my goodwill. The attachment you have formed is natural, it is perhaps inevitable, but it has grown in conditions that cannot produce a reliable assessment of its true nature. His voice remained gentle throughout, and it cost him something. She could see that it cost him something. What you feel is not love, Miss Highmore. It cannot be. Not here. Not yet. She wanted to argue. She had arguments prepared. But she was honest enough, and rigorous enough, to recognize that his logic was not without foundation. She could not prove her love was independent when she had not yet experienced independence. She could not demonstrate that she chose him freely when she had not yet had the conditions necessary for free choice. The arrangement, he continued, and she understood that this had been decided before she entered the room, will proceed when you have been here 2 years. I have already begun the necessary correspondence with the Dowager Countess of Pembridge, in Bath, a woman of genuine kindness and considerable moral seriousness, whose companion's position will provide you with respectable employment and true independence. A generous settlement has been established in your name. He paused. You must build your own life, Miss Highmore. You must discover who you are beyond these walls and beyond gratitude to me. Only then will you understand the difference between genuine feeling and the natural attachment of a woman to the man who changed the circumstances of her existence. Beatrice looked at him for a long moment. You are, she said finally, the most comprehensively stubborn man of my acquaintance. I am aware, he said. It does not alter my position. She left without further argument, because she was 18 and she was honest and she could not, in conscience, dismantle a position she was not entirely certain was wrong. But she was not certain it was right, either. The remaining months passed in a kind of disciplined sorrow. He withdrew further. She allowed it, because she had no alternative that did not compromise her own integrity. Jane was placed with a family in Edinburgh in the spring. Sophia departed for a teaching position in Derbyshire shortly after. The household grew quieter. The Duke grew quieter still, more isolated, more severe, more entirely himself in the most solitary sense of that word. Beatrice read. She studied. She thought with great care about the nature of love and the conditions required for its honest expression. She left, on the appointed day in late summer, in the Duke of Rothbury's carriage, with a generous settlement in her name and his characteristic note of farewell, brief, correct, entirely formal. She pressed it flat against her palm the entire journey to Bath. She did not weep until she was quite certain she was alone. Chapter 3: Separation and Independence. Bath was, Beatrice had concluded, a city that understood the art of appearing content. Its crescents and terraces presented their elegant faces to the world with the serene assurance of people who have arranged themselves correctly and intend to remain so. Its waters were taken with regularity. Its assembly rooms were attended with propriety. Its inhabitants moved through their days in the comfortable conviction that a life conducted according to established forms was a life conducted well. Beatrice found she could not entirely agree. But she had learned, in 2 years, to hold her disagreements with the lightness of a woman who understands that not every conviction requires immediate public expression. She had built a life here. This was not a small thing, and she did not treat it as one. The Dowager Countess of Pembridge was precisely as the Duke had described, a woman of genuine warmth, considerable intelligence, and a moral seriousness that had survived 6 to 7 years of society's determined efforts to erode it. She had taken one look at Beatrice upon her arrival, asked 3 questions of penetrating directness, received 3 honest answers, and said, "You will do very well, I think. I require a companion who can argue, not merely agree. Most young women sent to me have had the inconvenient habit of agreeing with everything I say, which is both tedious and useless." She had then assigned Beatrice a comfortable room, an adequate allowance, and unrestricted access to a library that rivaled the Duke's in breadth if not in the particular, precise intelligence of its curation. Beatrice had been grateful. She was still grateful every day, with the clear-eyed gratitude of a person who understands precisely what they have been given and does not take it as anything other than what it is. She had also been busy. The reformers had found her, or rather, she had found them, through careful inquiry conducted through the Countess's extensive correspondence network, following threads with the patient, methodical attention she had applied to philosophy at Rothbury. They were a small group, 2 sympathetic members of Parliament, a barrister of considerable principle, several women of independent means who moved through society with the useful invisibility that society granted to women it did not consider threatening. They worked quietly and with great care, collecting testimony, documenting evidence, drafting legislative proposals that had thus far encountered the predictable resistance of a parliament populated by men who found the subject either distasteful or inconvenient. Beatrice contributed anonymously. She wrote clearly and argued precisely and brought to the work the particular quality of a person who had sat on an auction platform and therefore did not require the suffering to be abstract in order to take it seriously. The barrister, a Mr. Forsyth, had told her on 2 occasions that her drafting was the best the group produced. She had thanked him and returned immediately to work. She had suitors. This was perhaps inevitable. She was 22, in good health, in possession of adequate if not lavish means, and the Countess, who enjoyed society with the frank pleasure of a woman who has nothing left to prove, introduced her widely. There was a pleasant solicitor who admired her opinions. There was a clergyman of liberal views who lent her books and was visibly delighted when she returned them with arguments. There was a widowed colonel of respectable fortune who looked at her with a straightforward, uncomplicated warmth she found genuinely touching. She could not imagine accepting any of them. She had examined this incapacity with the same honest rigor she brought to all things. She had asked herself whether it represented damage or unreasonable attachment, or a failure of practical sense. She had considered the Duke's argument, that what she felt within his household could not constitute reliable evidence of genuine love, and subjected it to 2 years of sustained examination. She had found it wanting. She knew herself now in ways she had not at 18, had not even at 20. She knew the shape of her own mind and the nature of her own courage and the specific texture of her own convictions. She had built an identity that owed nothing to the walls of Rothbury Manor and nothing to the man who had stood behind his desk and handed her a key. She had earned her own consequence, small as it presently was, and it was entirely hers. And having established this, having proven it to herself with the thoroughness the argument required, she found that what she felt for the Duke of Rothbury was not diminished by independence but clarified by it. She did not love him because he had saved her. She loved him because she knew, now, what it was to encounter genuine moral seriousness in the world, and she had not found it elsewhere. She loved him because midnight arguments about Wollstonecraft remained the standard against which she measured all subsequent conversation and found it consistently insufficient. She loved him because she understood his particular loneliness with the intimacy of someone who had witnessed it from the inside. She did not write to him. He had not written to her. This was correct, and she understood why it was correct, and she found it hollowing nonetheless. The intelligence reached her in October, through a channel she had not expected. Mr. Forsyth arrived at the Countess's house on a Tuesday afternoon with an expression of controlled urgency that she had learned to read as the particular look of a man in possession of information that required careful handling. He waited until they were alone in the small sitting room she used for reform work and then produced a document, a letter, written in code, which had come through a contact whose identity he declined to specify but whose reliability he vouched for without hesitation. She read it twice. Then she sat very still for a moment that was longer than it appeared. The auction network had grown suspicious of the Duke of Rothbury. The evidence was, in retrospect, difficult to explain away. Too many of his acquisitions had emerged, over the years, into visible respectability. A governess in Shropshire, a teacher in Derbyshire, several women settled in various counties under various arrangements that bore no resemblance to what was supposed to become of girls purchased at secret auctions. The organizers were careful men. They noticed discrepancies. They had discussed the matter amongst themselves and reached a conclusion. They intended to test him. The test was simple and absolute in its brutality. He was to supply one of the young women currently residing at Rothbury Manor to a client named Lord Halverson, a man whose proclivities were sufficiently extreme that even within this network, his name carried a particular weight of dread. If the Duke complied, he maintained his position in their confidence. If he refused, they would know precisely what he was, and they had the means and the motivation to destroy him completely. The letter contained no timeline. It contained, however, the strong implication that the demand would be made within a matter of weeks. Mr. Forsyth was watching her face with the careful attention of a man uncertain how she would respond. "How current is this intelligence?" she asked. "A fortnight old at most," he said. And the young women presently at the manor, are their names known? Not in the document I have received. But the implication is clear enough. There are, I understand, 2 currently in residence. Beatrice set the letter down on the table with a precision that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with the absolute necessity of appearing calm whilst one's mind worked at considerable speed. She thought about a woman she did not know, currently living in the hushed corridors of Rothbury Manor, who was about to become the instrument of a test she did not know was being administered. She thought about the Duke, in his isolation, with his strained finances and his darkening reputation and his absolute refusal to ask anyone for assistance he had not pre-approved. She thought about Lord Halverson's name and the specific dread it produced in a room full of people who dealt regularly with dreadful things. She thought, he will refuse. He will refuse, and they will destroy him, or he will find some third option that costs him more than he can afford. She thought, I have resources he does not. I have connections he does not. I have, for 2 years, been building exactly the apparatus that this situation requires. She thought, I did not do any of that for this purpose, but the purpose is here regardless. I must go to Rothbury, she said. She arrived unannounced on a Thursday morning, in a hired carriage, with 2 travelling bags and the complete absence of a plan for how to begin the conversation. The housekeeper, the same composed, revealing nothing Mrs. Alderton, received her with the practiced neutrality of a woman who had learned not to display surprise and led her to the study without commentary. The Duke was standing at the window when she entered. He turned, and she had a single unguarded moment in which to observe his face before he assembled it, the shock, the involuntary warmth of it, and then the immediate, familiar withdrawal behind composure. He looked, she thought with a private pang, exhausted. Not dramatically so, he was still impeccably correct in his person, still the Duke of Rothbury in every visible particular, but there was a quality to his severity now that suggested it was being maintained by will rather than nature. He had grown thinner. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there 2 years ago. Miss Highmore, he said. His voice was entirely controlled. I was not informed of your intended visit. It was not intended sufficiently in advance to permit notification, Your Grace. She set her travelling bag down and looked at him directly. I have intelligence regarding your current situation that requires your immediate attention. I would ask that you hear me before you say whatever you are preparing to say. A pause. And what, he said carefully, do you believe I am preparing to say? That I ought to be in Bath, building my life, and that my presence here is an unnecessary risk and an unwelcome complication. She met his gaze without difficulty. This was one of the things 2 years had given her. You may say all of that afterward, if you still feel it necessary. He said nothing. She took this as permission and told him what she knew. She watched his face as she spoke, watched the controlled stillness of a man absorbing information that confirmed a threat he had perhaps already suspected. When she finished, the silence in the study was of a different quality than any silence she remembered from her previous residence, heavier, more immediate. How did you obtain this intelligence? He asked. Through a reform network I have been working with for the past 18 months. I have been involved in drafting legislative proposals regarding the protection of vulnerable women. A pause. I have also been collecting documented evidence of the auction operation from the outside. Not enough for prosecution, as yet, but sufficient to constitute the foundation of a case. Something moved across his expression. You have been doing what you have been doing, Your Grace, but from a different angle and with different tools. She allowed this to settle. Which is precisely why I am here. Because I believe there is now a third option, and I believe it requires both of us to execute. His eyes sharpened. What third option? We expose the network entirely. Publicly, with irrefutable evidence, names, locations, financial records, and testimony from the women you have rescued who are willing to speak. We bring journalists, sympathetic magistrates, members of parliament. We end it not by continuing to operate within it, but by destroying it completely. She paused. It will end your ability to work in secret. That capacity is already compromised beyond recovery. But it will save every future victim, and it will do so permanently. He was quiet for a long time. You should not be here, he said finally. Not with anger, with something that sounded considerably more like pain. You should be in Bath, with your life, with your suitors and your reform work and everything you have built. You should not be risking yourself for my doomed crusade." "It is not solely your crusade," Beatrice said. "And I am 22 years of age and in full possession of my own judgment. I do not require your assessment of where I should be." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite the smile she remembered. Something more worn. "No," he said quietly. "I perceive that you do not." They worked through the day and into the evening, the study table covered in documents and correspondence, building the framework of a plan with the combined resources of his 3 years of internal documentation and her 18 months of external evidence. By nightfall, the architecture of it was clear, if still requiring considerable refinement. She would contact Mr. Forsyth and the sympathetic MPs in the morning. He would reach out to 3 of his previously placed women who had indicated, in various quiet ways, a willingness to speak if the moment ever came. It was late when she found him in the library. He stood before the mantelpiece, before Eleanor's portrait, in the exact attitude she had memorized 4 years ago, that particular stillness of a man communing with his own worst grief. The fire was low. The room held the hushed quality of a house that had learned silence and never quite unlearned it. She came to stand beside him and looked at the painted face of the young woman she had never known. "I have built my own life," she said quietly. "Not as a preamble. As a fact that required stating. I have formed my own identity. I have discovered my own strength and tested it in conditions that had nothing to do with you or this house or what I owe you. I have proven to myself, and I believe to you, that I do not need you." She paused. "And having done all of that, having become fully and genuinely independent, I have chosen to return. I love you. Not from gratitude, not from obligation, not from the natural attachment of a rescued woman to her rescuer. But because you are a man of extraordinary honor, and I am a woman who has now met enough of the world to know precisely how rare that is. I choose you freely, as an equal." The fire settled. The room was very quiet. Beatrice. Her name, in his voice, without her title, she had never heard it before. It sounded like something he had been holding for a very long time. "Do not tell me again what I feel," she said, gently. "I have had 2 years to examine it. I am certain of my findings." When he turned to look at her, his face had finally, at last, after years of glass and composure and careful distance, come undone. "I have loved you," he said, "since your first year in this house. I perceived it with absolute horror and I have hated myself for it with considerable consistency ever since. I told myself it was exploitation, that a man in my position could not feel such things without corrupting them simply by feeling them. I sent you away because I could no longer trust the distance I was maintaining." His voice remained low and entirely without its usual control. "You were never meant to love me, Beatrice. You were meant to be free." "I am free," she said. "I am more free than I have ever been. Free enough to choose you." A pause, and then, with the precision she brought to all arguments, "Unless you intend to deny me that choice, and prove yourself, in the end, a hypocrite. The very thing you have fought against." He looked at her for a long moment. Then the Duke of Rothbury, who had kept himself behind glass for longer than either of them could fully account for, crossed the remaining distance. The kiss began with the tentativeness of 2 people who have waited so long they have half forgotten how to begin. It did not remain tentative. It contained 4 years of midnight conversations and carefully maintained distances and books left on library tables and a key pressed against a palm on a journey to Bath. All of it, finally and completely released. When they separated, she rested her forehead briefly against his. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. His voice was different, stripped of its careful architecture, simply his. The plan awaited them. The danger was real and immediate and required clear heads and steady nerves. Tomorrow, they would begin the most consequential and hazardous work either of them had undertaken. But tonight, in the library, before Eleanor's portrait and the dying fire, they had finally chosen each other. And that, Beatrice thought, was sufficient for one evening. Chapter 4: Exposure and Resolution. The plan required 4 days to assemble properly. Beatrice spent those days in a state of controlled urgency she had not previously known herself capable of sustaining, writing letters, receiving replies, coordinating between Mr. Forsyth and the 2 sympathetic MPs, a Mr. Cavendish and a Sir Robert Hale, who had been awaiting precisely such an opportunity and responded to her correspondence with the speed of men who understood that hesitation had its own moral cost. The Duke, meanwhile, produced from the locked drawer of his study desk a document she had not known existed, a leather-bound journal, 3 years in the making, containing dates, names, financial transactions, and precise descriptions of every auction he had attended. It was, Mr. Forsyth declared upon receiving it, the most comprehensively damning record of criminal enterprise he had encountered in 20 years of legal practice. 2 journalists were engaged, men of established reputation whose editors had been quietly pursuing this story for months and required only the evidence to print it. 3 magistrates with unimpeachable records were briefed in conditions of absolute secrecy. 7 of the Duke's previously placed women, contacted through careful intermediaries, confirmed their willingness to provide signed testimony. 16 more, reached through Beatrice's reform network, added their voices. 23 testimonies in total, representing 23 lives interrupted and then, through the Duke's extraordinary and costly intervention, rebuilt. The next auction was scheduled for a Thursday. They had, between them, precisely enough time. Beatrice had insisted on the disguise herself, and she had insisted with the calm, immovable quality she had developed for arguments she did not intend to lose. The Duke had objected, comprehensively, methodically, with every reasonable counterargument available to him, and she had listened to each objection with genuine attention and then explained, with equal precision, why the plan required her presence and not a substitute. "The organizers know the faces of women you have purchased before," she said. "They have become suspicious. A woman unknown to them, presented through a channel they trust, will draw the most powerful men forward. That is precisely what we require. Witnesses must see the principals, Your Grace, not merely the periphery." He had looked at her for a long time with an expression she had learned to read as a man conducting an internal argument he already knows he has lost. "I do not like this," he said. "You are not required to like it," she replied. "You are required to trust my judgment." Another long pause. "I do trust your judgment," he said, quietly. "It is the situation I object to." "Then we are in agreement on the situation and may proceed." She arrived at the London townhouse on Thursday evening in a hired carriage under a false name, Miss Anne Carlyle, presented through an intermediary the network trusted, dressed in a gown not her own, her hair arranged differently, her bearing adjusted with the deliberate care of a woman who understood that her role required her to appear frightened and uncertain. This was, she found, the most demanding aspect of the performance. She was neither. The room was familiar in its essential architecture, the drawn curtains, the covered mirrors, the candles positioned to illuminate rather than comfort. The platform was the same low wooden construction. The masked men arranged before it were, in their expensive indifference, indistinguishable from the men she remembered at 18. She stood very still and did not look for him immediately. When she did, she found him at the room's edge, as before, dark-haired, grey-eyed, his face composed into an expression of cold assessment that she knew, now, cost him considerably more than it appeared to. His eyes found hers for precisely 1 second and then moved away. In that second she read everything he was not permitted to show, the controlled fury of a man watching the woman he loved subjected to the appraising regard of men he held in profound contempt. She gave him the slightest inclination of her head. "I am well. Proceed." His jaw tightened fractionally. He proceeded. The bidding began. She kept her eyes forward and her breathing even and catalogued the room with the methodical attention she had brought to everything since Rothbury, counting faces, noting positions, identifying the 3 men near the door whose purpose was not participation but security. Lord Halverson she identified before he spoke, from the description she had been given, a heavy man in late middle age whose masked face could not conceal the particular quality of his attention, which was the attention of someone who has never encountered a limit to what he might take. He began bidding early and with aggressive confidence. The Duke bid against him. His voice was entirely without inflection, cold, precise, the voice of a man whose interest was financial rather than personal. Halverson raised. The Duke raised further. The room watched with the focused interest of men who understood that they were witnessing a contest between 2 of the most substantial bids the evening had produced. The tension in Beatrice's chest was considerable. She managed it by thinking about Mr. Forsyth, currently positioned in a carriage on the street outside with 2 magistrates and a journalist whose editor had cleared the front page. She thought about Sir Robert Hale, inside the house, disguised as a late arrival, positioned near the room's secondary entrance. She thought about 23 signed testimonies folded in the document case beneath the platform, exactly where she had placed it upon arrival. She thought, 30 more seconds. She thought, 20. She thought, now. The Duke's hand moved, a single, small gesture, the adjustment of a coat cuff, and the room's 2 secondary doors opened simultaneously. What followed was not chaos immediately. It was, for approximately 4 seconds, a silence of absolute incomprehension, the silence of men who have operated in perfect impunity for so long that the concept of consequence has become genuinely foreign to them. Then the magistrates identified themselves, the journalists entered with their notebooks, Sir Robert Hale stepped forward and announced himself, and the incomprehension resolved into pandemonium. The Duke's voice cut through it. Gentlemen. Cold, precise, entirely carrying. I am the Duke of Rothbury. For the past 3 years, I have attended 14 such auctions, purchased 9 young women, and documented every transaction, every name, and every arrangement made within this network with the intention of providing irrefutable evidence to the appropriate authorities. He produced the leather journal from his coat. I now do so. Beatrice stepped down from the platform. She had already removed the outer layer of her disguise, the wig, the specific arrangement of her hair, and she stood before the room as herself, Miss Beatrice Highmore, and placed the document case on the auctioneer's table. 23 testimonies, she said, to the magistrates and the journalists and the frozen, masked men who were beginning, one by one, to calculate their options and find them severely limited. Signed, witnessed, and dated. Together with financial records tracing payments through 3 banking houses and correspondence documenting the network's membership and operations over 5 years. Lord Halverson moved toward the document case with the purposeful speed of a large man who has decided that destroying evidence is preferable to all other available options. He was restrained by 2 magistrates before he reached it, and the restraint was not gentle. Several other men attempted the doors and found them equally impassable. The auctioneer had become entirely still, with the expression of a man who is performing rapid calculations regarding the precise degree of his culpability and finding the results unwelcome. 3 men, Beatrice counted them, succeeded in some form of flight before the exits were fully secured. She noted this with the cold practicality of someone who understands that no operation of this complexity concludes without cost. 3 men free was a failure. It was also, in the context of what the evening had otherwise accomplished, a containable one. The arrests took some time. The journalists wrote with extraordinary speed. The Duke found her in the corridor afterward, away from the noise and the official proceedings still unfolding in the drawing room. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, something rawer than his usual contained warmth, something that had been under considerable strain for the past several hours. You are unharmed, he said. It was not precisely a question. Entirely, she confirmed. You held your position admirably, Your Grace. I was aware of some concern in your expression at approximately the midpoint of Lord Halverson's bidding. There was no concern in my expression. There was the very slightest concern, she said. I found it rather endearing. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he offered her his arm, with the formal correctness that had never entirely left him, and she took it, and they walked out of that house together into the cold London night. The newspapers were comprehensive and merciless. The story occupied front pages for a fortnight. Names were printed, lords, merchants, 2 members of Parliament whose constituents received the news with varying degrees of shock and, in several cases, a retrospective awareness of various behaviors that now required recontextualization. Some men fled to the continent before warrants could be executed. Others faced prosecution with the particular indignation of people who have never previously been held accountable for anything and find the experience deeply unreasonable. The Duke of Rothbury's reputation underwent a transformation so rapid and complete that several commentators remarked upon it as though it were a meteorological event, sudden, total, rearranging everything it touched. The creepy, isolated Duke became, within the space of a week, a figure of considerable public admiration. Women sent letters to Rothbury Manor. A satirical print appeared depicting him in heroic posture, which he found, Beatrice observed, deeply uncomfortable. You might endeavor to appear marginally less pained by the approval of strangers, she told him. I find it considerably more difficult to manage than disapproval, he said. I had grown accustomed to disapproval. It required very little of me. But the costs were real, and he did not minimize them. 3 men had escaped and would establish their operations elsewhere. This he acknowledged with the unflinching honesty of someone who refuses the comfort of pretending that partial victory is complete. His finances were in a condition that required the word depleted in its most comprehensive sense. The estate's mortgage had been extended twice already. His ability to operate in secret was permanently concluded. His face and purpose were now known to every criminal network in England. He sat with these facts in the evenings and did not pretend they were other than they were. The woman arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the exposure. Mrs. Alderton brought the card to the study where Beatrice and the Duke were working, and the Duke read the name upon it, and went entirely still in a way that was different from his customary stillness, different in kind, in quality, in what it cost him to maintain. He rose without speaking and went to the entrance hall. She was in her mid-20s, dark-haired, grey-eyed, with a quality of composed self-possession that Beatrice, watching from the doorway, found immediately and powerfully familiar. Beside her stood a gentleman of warm aspect and steady bearing who held her hand with the unceremonious ease of a man long accustomed to the gesture. "James," she said. Simply that. His name, without title, as though titles had never been relevant between them. What followed was not a scene that required witnesses. Beatrice withdrew quietly to the library and sat for some time without reading anything, listening to the house around her. She heard, at one point, a sound from the entrance hall that the Duke of Rothbury would have died rather than permit in company, a single, brief, entirely undisguised expression of grief released at last from years of containment. She pressed her hands flat against the library table and breathed steadily and was deeply, quietly glad. When he came to her, an hour later, his eyes were red-rimmed and his composure was the rebuilt kind, assembled carefully over recent emotion. Eleanor and Thomas Garrett were settled in the drawing-room with tea. Eleanor had told him everything, Garrett's rescues, conducted in parallel and in complete ignorance of the Duke's own operation, her education, her freedom, her marriage to a man who had loved her with genuine respect. 5 years of good life, she had told him. She did not blame him. She had never blamed him. He had been 20 years old. There was nothing he could have done. "She is well," he said, to Beatrice, in the library. She is well." "I know," Beatrice said. "Sit down, Your Grace." He Saturday. She poured him tea with the brisk practicality of someone who understands that some moments require neither eloquence nor analysis, but simply the ordinary comfort of a warm cup and another person's steady presence. They sat together in the library that had witnessed so much of their history, and were quiet, and it was enough. He found her in the garden that evening. It was a cold, clear night, the kind that made the stars precise and the air smell of coming frost. She was walking the gravel path that ran along the manor's south face, walking with purpose, because she rarely moved without it, when she heard his step behind her and slowed. He came to walk beside her. They completed one length of the path in companionable silence before he spoke. "I have very little to offer you," he said. This was characteristic, direct, undecorated, without preamble. "The estate is mortgaged. My fortune is largely spent. My capacity to operate as I have done is entirely concluded. I am, in material terms, considerably less than I was when you first arrived here." A pause. "I am also damaged, in ways I suspect are not entirely temporary, by 4 years of deliberate isolation and the particular weight of secrets kept too long." He stopped walking. She stopped also. "I cannot offer you wealth or security or the consequence of an unencumbered dukedom. I can offer only myself, flawed and diminished and rather more tired than I appear, entirely and without reservation, if you will have me." He turned to face her fully. "Will you marry me, Beatrice? Not because I saved you once, years ago, but because we might, going forward, save each other?" She looked at him, at this man she had loved through terror and gratitude and independence and return, this man who had given everything he had to strangers and now stood before her with almost nothing left and offered it anyway. "You are asking the wrong question," she said. "The question is not whether I will have you. I settled that question 2 years ago and have not revisited it since." She held his gaze without difficulty, without doubt. The question is whether you will finally accept that I chose you long ago, and that nothing, not poverty, not scandal, not your comprehensive and deeply characteristic stubbornness, will alter that choice. The Duke of Rothbury looked at her for one long, final moment of the particular hesitation that had defined 4 years of his life. Then it left him, simply, completely, as though it had been waiting for permission to go. They were married in the Rothbury Estate Chapel on a morning in December, when the grounds were white and the light was the particular silver of a winter that has decided to be beautiful. 23 women attended, at various stages of the independent lives they had built with the foundation he had provided. They filled the small chapel with the specific warmth of people who understand precisely what they are celebrating and find it entirely adequate cause. The Dowager Countess of Pembridge, magnificent in grey silk and what appeared to be genuine emotion imperfectly concealed, gave Beatrice away with the firm grip of a woman who has decided to treat the role with appropriate seriousness. Eleanor and Thomas Garrett stood as witnesses, Eleanor with the grey eyes of her family and a composure that cracked, briefly and beautifully, at precisely the right moment. Society's opinion was divided, as society's opinion generally was regarding anything that defied straightforward categorization. Several commentators found the romance inspiring. Several others found the circumstances irregular. Neither Beatrice nor the Duke read the relevant publications with any great attention. They built the organization together, in the months that followed, with the combined resources of Beatrice's reform connections and the public sympathy the exposure had generated. It was legal, transparent, and entirely public, a foundation for the rescue and rehabilitation of vulnerable women, funded by donation, governed by a committee that included Eleanor, Thomas Garrett, Mr. Forsyth, Sir Robert Hale, and the Dowager Countess of Pembridge, who joined with the frank enthusiasm of a woman who has been waiting for a worthy project. The work was slower and more complicated than secrecy had permitted. It was also considerably more durable. 5 years later, the library at Rothbury Manor was loud. This was the most remarkable change, the simple noise of it. Where silence had once been the house's primary discipline, there were now voices in the corridors, footsteps on the stairs, the specific productive din of a building that has found its purpose. The drawing room served as a meeting room on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The former isolation of the grounds had been replaced by a regular procession of reformers, legislators, and women in various stages of rebuilding lives interrupted by men who had believed themselves untouchable. Beatrice sat at the library table, her table now, covered in the working documents of a piece of legislation she had been drafting for 3 months, surrounded by 4 female reformers of formidable collective intelligence, when the door opened. The Duke entered with their daughter on his shoulders. The child was 2 years old, dark-haired, and in possession of an expression of absolute imperious certainty that her mother recognized and her father had learned to negotiate with the careful diplomacy it required. He set her down at the table's edge with the ease of a man who had discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, that fatherhood suited him entirely. Beatrice looked up from her draft and met her husband's eyes across the table. She remembered, in the way one remembers things that have become foundational rather than merely memorable, an 18-year-old girl on a wooden platform in a candlelit room, who had counted panels on a wall and thought about Mary Wollstonecraft and promised herself she would not show fear. She remembered a carriage ride through darkness and a key placed on the corner of a desk and a voice that had said, "You are not my prisoner." She had found a hero that night. She understood now that this was the smallest part of what she had found. She had found an equal. She had found a partner. She had found, in the most unlikely library, in the most unlikely circumstances, the man with whom she would choose, every day, freely, without obligation or confusion or the comfortable distortions of gratitude, to build a life that neither of them could have imagined from inside the darkness they had each, in their different ways, survived. Their daughter climbed confidently into the nearest chair and regarded the assembled reformers with the evaluating grey eyes of her father and the absolute composure of a child who has grown up in a house full of purposeful women and considers this entirely normal. Beatrice returned to her draft. The manor filled with voices. And the Duke of Rothbury, who had spent 4 years cultivating silence and solitude and the reputation of a monster, stood in the doorway of his library and watched his home be loud and full and alive, and found that it was, without qualification, without reservation, without the slightest remaining shadow of the man he had been required to pretend to be. Enough. More than enough. Everything.